Chapter 12. Together at last. The next day, it rained. Bruno watched it coming down hard outside the window during his lessons with Herr List. It was still raining heavily at lunchtime, but luckily, it stopped when Herr List was leaving. Bruno got a pair of boots and a heavy raincoat and then left the house. When he reached Shmuel, the sky was still dark, but there was no rain. Shmuel was standing for a change. "Hello, Bruno," he said when he saw his friend coming. "I wasn't sure if you were coming."
"Hello, Shmuel. Yes, I wasn't sure either."
Then Shmuel put out his hands and showed Bruno a pair of dirty striped pajamas and a cloth cap.
"Do you still want to help me find Father?"
he said, and Bruno nodded quickly. Then Shmuel lifted the bottom of the fence and passed the clothes to Bruno, who put them on. He did not have a bag for his other clothes, so he had to put them on the wet mud.
"This is like being in one of Grandmother's plays," he said, smiling and turning around in circles.
"You need to take off your boots," said Shmuel.
"No one wears them in here, and they will know that you are different."
Bruno sighed, but he knew that his friend was right. He took off the boots and left them next to the clothes. At first, it felt horrible putting his feet in the mud, but then he started to enjoy it. Then Shmuel lifted the fence, and Bruno lay down and pushed himself under it. When he stood up on the other side, he had mud all over his pajamas, and it felt wonderful. The boys both smiled. Bruno wanted to put his arms around Shmuel, but something stopped him. Shmuel felt the same. He wanted to thank Bruno for coming to see him and bringing him food, and for helping him to look for Father. Together, they started walking towards the long buildings. It did not take long to reach them. Bruno's eyes opened wide in surprise at what he saw around him. He always imagined lots of happy families. He imagined mothers who sat outside in the evenings and told stories to their children. He imagined the children playing games and a shop or cafe, and maybe even a fruit and vegetable market. But the truth was very different. No one was sitting outside the buildings telling stories, and the children were not playing. There were only crowds of people standing or sitting together in striped pajamas, looking at the ground. They were all very thin, and they all looked very, very sad. In one corner, Bruno could see 3 soldiers. They were watching about 20 men in striped pajamas. They were shouting at them, and some of the men kept falling down with their heads in their arms. In another corner, he could see more soldiers standing with guns under their arms and laughing. They kept pointing the guns at different people.
"I don't think that I like it here," said Bruno.
"I don't like it either," said Shmuel.
"I think that I should go home."
Shmuel stopped walking and looked at him.
"But you promised to help me find Father," he said.
Bruno thought about it.
"I did promise you. You're right," he said. "Let's keep looking."
The 2 boys walked around the buildings. They did not know what they were looking for, but Bruno was happy to be exploring. But they did not find Shmuel's father, and soon the sky began to turn very dark.
"I think it might rain again," said Bruno. "I should go home. I'm sorry we haven't found him."
Shmuel nodded his head sadly. He was not really surprised, because he did not expect to find his father. He opened his mouth to answer. But at that moment, one of the soldiers shouted. Then 10 soldiers came to the area of the camp where Bruno and Shmuel were standing.
"What's happening?"
said Bruno.
"It happens sometimes," replied Shmuel. "They make people go on marches." "Marches?" said Bruno, frowning. "I can't go on a march. I have to get home. We have chicken for dinner tonight." "Be quiet," said Shmuel. "Don't say anything, or they will get angry."
Bruno was happy that all the people in the striped pajamas were standing together now, and he and Shmuel were in the middle. The soldiers could not see them. But Bruno did not understand why everyone looked so frightened. He wanted to tell them that everything was fine, that Father was the commandant. If he wanted them to go on marches, then it had to be all right. There was another shout, and then everyone began to march slowly with Bruno and Shmuel still in the middle.
"Do the marches last for a long time?"
Bruno whispered to Shmuel, because he was feeling quite hungry now.
"I don't think so," replied Shmuel. "I never see the people after the marches, but I don't think they do."
Bruno looked up at the black sky. It was beginning to rain heavily again. He could feel the wet mud on his body, and his pajamas were now very wet. He wanted very much to be back in his house, watching from his bedroom window.
"That's enough," he said to Shmuel. "I'm going home."
But as he said this, he felt steps under his feet, and suddenly the group of people were marching down into a long room with no windows. It was very warm and dry.
"Well, that's good," he said,
happy to be out of the rain.
"I expect we'll wait here until the rain stops, and then I'll go home. I'm sorry we didn't find your father." "It's all right," said Shmuel. "And I'm sorry we didn't play, but we will when you come to Berlin, and you can meet... Oh, what were their names?"
But he could not remember any of his friends' names or their faces. Then he did something surprising. He reached down and held Shmuel's hand.
"You're my best friend, Shmuel," he said. "My best friend for life."
But Bruno did not hear what Shmuel replied, because at that moment there were loud shouts as the door to the room was closed.
"Maybe it's to stop the rain from coming in,"
Bruno thought. Then everything went dark. Bruno kept holding Shmuel's hand, and even when everyone began to scream, he knew that he must never stop holding it. No one saw Bruno again after that. They looked around the house and went to the village with pictures of the little boy, but no one knew where he was. A few days later, one of the soldiers found his clothes and boots by the fence and went to get the commandant. Bruno's father looked around the area and along the fence, but he did not find his son. Mother did not go back to Berlin immediately. She stayed at Outwith for 3 months, waiting for news of Bruno. Then one day she suddenly thought, maybe he went back to Berlin. She took Gretel and quickly went back to the city. He was not there, of course. Gretel threw away her maps and newspapers and stayed in her room and cried. She was not sad because she left her dolls at Outwith, but because she missed Bruno so much. Father stayed at Outwith for another year, but the other soldiers stopped liking him because he shouted a lot and was always angry. He went to bed every night thinking about Bruno and woke up thinking about him. One day, he had an idea about what happened to his son. He went back to the place where the clothes were found the year before. Then he noticed the broken wire and lifted it, and saw that there was a hole big enough for a boy to get through. He looked at the long wooden buildings, and then imagined Bruno's journey towards them. Suddenly, his legs did not seem to be working, and then he was sitting on the ground. A few months after that, some other soldiers came to Outwith, and Father had to leave with them. He went silently, because he did not care what they did to him. And that is the end of the story about Bruno and his family. Of course, this was a long time ago, and nothing like this could ever happen again, could it? Penguin Readers. The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas.